Welcome to the Profile Corner. In today's video I'll be building a couple of boxes to hang up onto the wall. Inside those boxes will be some network equipment that looks like this. This is just one of the pieces of equipment that'll be going into there. As a matter of fact, this one has 8 ports on the front of it. Another one that'll be going into one of the boxes will have 16 ports on the front of it, and there'll be little cables like this dangling out of the front of it. And I've got to be careful in terms of how far I can bend these cables coming out of the front. And so I've got to use a little bit of strategy here so that the cables will fit down inside and we allow the heat to escape out of the boxes so that these don't overheat in the middle of the summertime in a climate that has no air conditioning. Also, in the box that gets constructed, I need to have a battery backup system so that this will continue working even when electricity goes out. That seems to happen once in a while around here, and those power outages seem to last for 4 to 6 hours, maybe even longer than that. I've got a battery backup unit here that would work. I did a little bit of testing with this. This will actually run my 7 amp Bosch sander along with a dust extractor for about 23 seconds before it trips for going over the maximum capacity of the unit. But if I just ran the sander on it, I believe it would run for probably an hour, maybe 2 hours on this UPS unit. I don't need anything this big, however, because this is quite heavy to hang up onto the wall. And so what I figured I would do is use a smaller unit. As you can see here, this is one example of a UPS that could be used to provide electrical power when the electricity is not working. And so I'm going to be using this style in at least one of the boxes. The other box may have a different style that has a larger UPS in it, but I'll be concerned about that later on. For the material that I'll be using, I want to use up some of the plywood that I've got around here. I've got this oak plywood that I bought several years ago in a shop cabinet for the table saw and also for one of my other pieces of equipment. This plywood does not measure 3/4 of an inch thick. I just measured it, and it seems to measure about 11/16 of an inch thick, which is kind of interesting. I thought it'd be a little bit closer to 3/4 of an inch. This also has a significant warpage in it in both directions, but I believe if I cut it down small enough, it'll be flat enough to be able to be used in the project. Now, for edge banding that plywood where necessary, I'll use a technique that I used on other cabinets that I built from the plywood and attach these 1/8 inch thick strips to it using regular glue, and then I'll just use clamps to hold it in place until the glue dries. These are leftover pieces from previous projects, so I'll have to cut some fresh 1/8 inch thick strips that are 11/16 of an inch in this dimension. I was trying to figure out the best way to organize these components inside the box. I'll tip the camera down and we'll take a look at a couple different ideas. Okay, let's start out with the dimensions of the UPS. This UPS is about 3¼ inches tall all by itself. And then if I include the power cord here and how I would have to have it wrap around to get out of the box, I need to allow, it looks like, about 14 inches of space in total. At front to back, I need, it looks like about 6 inches, so that the box needs to be at least that large that we build. I've also got the switch here, and the switch has some special requirements. Any electrical cables that are routed near one of these network cables needs to be at a 90-degree angle to the network cable so that there's no cross interference between the power cable and the network cable. So I've got to be kind of careful about it. This side back here has the surge in battery, so this is the side that gets powered when there's no electrical power going into the electric cable. And so I've got to have things plugged in back here, which means that I do not want to have the network cables coming out on this side of the UPS in the back. And so I need to actually have it rotated around this way. One thought is that I could actually have the network switch just like that, but I'm kind of concerned that for the same reason that you don't want to have power cables close to network cables, this may also pose a risk. And so what I'm thinking I'll do is actually elevate this above the UPS, just like this, essentially covering up these power ports that will not be used, and allow the back side for the power cables to go straight down. And that way they're at a 90-degree angle to this. Okay, so the only issue that I've got now is that this switch, while it's rather kind of small, it actually requires a big power supply that looks like this. And the reason why this has got to be so big is that this switch is actually able to power other devices that are plugged into the network ports. And so I've got to take this into consideration as well. So I've got to find a home for this, as well as a way to situate everything. So what I'm thinking now is that I can allow this to hover over the top. The network cables are going to need about 3 inches in the front to allow them to curve, just like that. And so what I think I can do is I can just put this other power supply right down here in the front, just like that. And then I can make this work out as long as this is elevated up. And I've got to allow enough room for the cables to bend around and come out. Now, in looking at this a little bit further, I think I actually have to reverse this, so this would not be the front of that cabinet here. I would actually have to spin this around just like so, and have the front of the cabinet be this side, the back of the switch should be to the front, and that way these cables can be routed out through the back of the cabinet and up or down or straight out the back, however it works out the best. And that would also work out for these power cables then, which could also be routed out through the back of the cabinet, either up or down, whichever way works out the best. Okay, so raw volume size here, this is what it's going to take from what I've done in calculations. I need to have 14 inches of available space side to side inside the cabinet. I need to have front to back, it looks like that needs to be 9 inches, and bottom to top, that needs to be at least 6 inches, preferably 7 inches in height. And then outside of that box area would be built the cabinet. Okay, so I need to do a little bit of calculation here to figure out the size of my boards. I want to use either dados or rabbets to lock these pieces together with glue. So I need to take into account the 3/8 of an inch I'm going to need for each of those dados or rabbets. And so this 14 inches actually needs to be 14 3/4 for the length of this board that'll be on the bottom. Now, front to back, it's 9 inches. I'll have to figure out how much longer that needs to be so that it fits. Possibly up to 9 3/4 of an inch in length. And then height-wise, I could have a similar issue where I need to have 3/8 of an inch reserved down here at the bottom and also up at the top. So let's get started here, cutting down the size of this plywood, trying to make sure that we get flat sections out of that plywood. I used my straight edge to determine where the worst of the warpage is in this plywood, I've got the straight edge flat on the end of the board to your right, and with it flat against the board down there, I can slide a 1/2 inch thick setup block underneath my straight edge. And so, if possible, I want to avoid using this section of the plywood out here. It seems to be much more flat in the other direction. As you can see there, it's almost completely flat. There's a small gap back here, but it's only about a 32nd of an inch at its worst. And I think if I cut this board down, then I can actually get rid of that curvature, or at least make it minimized. Okay, so let's get started at the table saw, and we'll start cutting down this board, trying to use this end of the board first. Okay, I've come up with some rough dimensions for the boards that I'm going to need. I think I'll need 2 boards that are 9 3/4 by 14 3/4. Those will be the bottom. I'll need 2 boards that are 9 3/4 by 14 3/4. That'll be the top section up here. 2 boards that are 9 by 14 3/4. That'll be the front. 2 boards that are 9 by 14 3/4, and that'll be the back. I'll also need sideboards here. I may have to get those out of another piece of plywood, but I'll figure out those dimensions later on. Okay, so I'm going to get started with this plywood. Right now I've got the factory edge back here against the fence on the crosscut table. I've got a factory edge down here on the end. I want to get rid of both of those factory edges. I've got a cut edge up here that I don't really trust whether or not it's straight. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to start out by oversizing the initial cut. I'm going to be cutting to 31 inches long. That way I can get rid of up to 1 inch down here on the end. And then we can work on getting these boards to be sized a little bit smaller. Okay, this section down here, I want to try to avoid using. This is a section that's badly warped. I made a measurement from down here at the end, 30 inches, to this point right here, and then I'll be splitting that in half later on. And I've got the factory cut edge on this side, so I'll run that against the rip fence, and I'll just clean up this cut edge down here by taking off maybe 1/8 of an inch on this side. And I'll take a 9 3/4 inch strip out of each one of these boards. I've set up the stock guides here to hopefully help keep the board in alignment with the rip fence, just so it doesn't drift away. Okay, now I'll cut these boards down to 9 inches wide. And now I want to make sure that the end of this board is square, so I'll cut it again, and then I'll cut down these boards into 14 3/4 inch lengths. All of them that I've got here so far. Here's the boxes roughly assembled. There's voids in the middle of this plywood, which is kind of unfortunate, but this is just the way the plywood from the big box stores is, or at least it was 20 years ago, or however old this plywood is. Also, the veneers are paper thin. This plywood originally came out of China, and as you can see here, even without sanding, it's less than 1/1000th of an inch thick right through here. You can actually see right through it to the glue. So I'll have to be very careful when I sand this down. The bottom down here will be raised up an inch, and so I'll be putting in a dado starting out at an inch from the bottom here and running the length. So I need to go over to the dado saw and set up a dado set that is 11/16 of an inch wide. I've got the dado set to 11/16 of an inch wide. I did a test cut on this board, hopefully going to 3/8 of an inch deep, and I actually went a little bit deeper than that, and so I've made a small adjustment to the blade height. If I test these boards in the cut, they seem to fit fairly well. I think they'll fit even better with a little bit of glue. And this is 1 inch from the bottom to the bottom of the board here, and that is hopefully allow enough glue on the bottom layers underneath this top layer so that they hopefully do not separate when this is assembled and weight is applied onto the assembled cabinet. Now I've got an X marked onto each board showing where the dado should be cut. And down here on the end, it's flush with a 3/8 inch setup block. In the middle here, there's about a 2/1000th difference where the setup block is proud of the surface. And then at the other end down here, they're flush. And next what I need to do is put in a 3/8 inch deep rabbet right in here and also in here that is 11/16 of an inch in this direction so that it'll receive the top that'll go into there. So I'll need to set up sacrificial fence on the rip fence, and then we could use the same dado blade setup that we've already got down here. I have the sacrificial fence on the rip fence. I have the rip fence set so that the inside tooth of the dado stack should be directly in line with the surface of this sacrificial fence. So now we're ready to make the cuts. Here we can see that the top of this board is flush with the top of this board. And so we've got that rabbet cut in exactly the right spot. Now we can do a little bit of glue up. Before the glue up, I should sand the interior surfaces of the boards so that I can make them look somewhat decent. They're a little bit rough. As you can see here, there's some staining. I've got to be careful that I don't get too aggressive with the sanding, because once again, this veneer is extremely thin. You can see through it already right here. Now, it's not perfect, but it's a little bit better than what it was. The staining won't be seen from the outside because that'll be inside the box. Okay, let's get this glued up. I have the boards laid out here, how they'll be glued up. The bottom will be glued into these slots. So I'll want to apply glue to this surface here and also the surfaces down in here, because there's some end grain in plywood, obviously, because the grain is going in two different directions. So I want to make sure that I use plenty of glue so I don't create a glue-starved joint. I will not be gluing in the top, but I'll be attaching the top just during the glue up to make sure that everything is square. Underneath, I'll be setting up 4 parallel jaw clamps, and then on top, I'll use 2 of these clamps just to hold the top together. Now we need to make sure that it's square on the inside. That looks good. Tighten up the clamps ever so slightly. And I'm going to check the back side for square. Looks good. Okay, I'll get the second one clamped up exactly the same way as this one. I'll do that off camera. While the glue is setting up, let's get a measurement of what the sideboards need to measure. This board needs to measure just under 10 3/8 this direction, and in this direction it needs to measure 9 inches, just like the other boards that we cut right here. So let's go over to the table saw and we can get started on that. We've got to keep in mind that on the front side we want to add in an 1/8 inch thick board to band the edge of the plywood so that it's not seen. So we've got to actually subtract an 1/8 inch from that 9 3/8 inch measurement to get 9 1/4 inches for the width. Okay, first what I want to do is to clean up this edge of the plywood. So I'll set the rip fence so that it's about an 1/8 inch narrower than the width of this board. Okay, I've got the rip fence set to 9 inches wide. We'll be making a cut, and then I'll make another cut. And now I'll square up the end of the plywood, and then I'll make 2 cuts at just under 10¼ inches long. Looks like I can get the 3rd board out of this also, so I'll go ahead and undo that. Now I need to rip down some red oak boards to be an 1/8 inch thick and 11/16 of an inch wide. So what I've done is I've set up the rip fence so that this plywood board will just slide through, and there's just an ever so slight amount of clearance between the blade and the board. And so now if I were to cut this board down, which just happens to be the right height to fit, it almost never happens that I find a scrap board that is just long enough. So if I run this through like this, then this board should end up to be the same thickness as this, and then I can cut my 1/8 inch strips from this board. Now I've got to be careful because this blade is going to be up quite high, and I don't have the blade guard on here because I can't have it on there when I'm not making a through cut. So what I'm going to try to do is to hold it using this push stick. For an extra measure of safety, I've added in a feather board to keep this board pushed against the fence. Okay, now I can get out my thin rip jig and I can cut off 1/8 inch thick sections of this board. Okay, I've pushed the rip fence up tight against the blade, and then I've used a 1/4 inch setup block here to represent the 1/8 inch width of the blade plus the 1/8 inch that I want to have on the outside of the blade. So now I've got this thin rip jig set in the right spot. So I can take out the setup block, and now I can move the rip fence over and install the blade guard so that I keep my fingers safe. Okay, now all I need to do is bring the rip fence over until it touches the board. Then lock it down. Okay, now I can glue these boards onto the plywood. I cut extra just in case I need them. Before we head over to do the glue up of these 1/8-inch thick boards, probably makes sense to cut them to a length of 9 inches first. So I need to square up the end first. So what I've done is I've set my stop at 9 1/8 inches. So I'll cut off the ends, and then I'll move the stop over to 9 inches and then cut the other end. So I've got the boards just loosely sitting on the front of the plywood. I've marked an eye on the inside face of the plywood for the sides, and I've also put an arrow pointing to the front of the cabinet so that I can get the orientation in the same way later on. What I've tried to do is pick the best face to be pointing out on the cabinets. The inside faces don't look quite as nice. So I'll get these glued on using the same technique that I used before, applying glue to both surfaces, and I'll get them clamped up, and then I'll bring the camera back after the glue sets up. I have the glue ups out of the clamps now, and I've scraped away any of the excessive glue. And now what we need to do is add in some additional rabbits and dados to match this profile here that you see on the end of each one of these boxes into the sides. So we'll have an 11/16 inch area removed here, and here, and here, and then also a dado going through this section right here. I already have the 11/16 inch dado stack set up in the dado saw, and it's set up for making these cuts. So let's get over to the dado saw, and we'll make those cuts now. Okay, on these boards, I'll have to cut this side right up against the edge. This other one needs to be over 1 inch, and so I'll wait to cut this one. So what I want to do first then is cut this edge here so that I know which of these needs to be cut, and I'll come back and I'll do these other two sides on each of these 4 sets of sideboards. Okay, now I can relocate the fence to cut this dado 1 inch from this edge. The ends fit onto the boxes without too much trouble. I did have to use a rubber mallet to knock this one in. It would go in halfway, and then when I tried to put in the other side, the first side would pop out. But now it's sitting down in there just like it should. So what I'll do is I'll remove the lids on these boxes, and then I'll get the ends glued on. And then we'll make some modifications to the lids so that it's easier to get in to these boxes, and also to allow the cables to come out of the boxes. I'll get these glued up off camera. I have the top of the cabinets here. This is the back portion of the top. And what I'd like to do is cut out the section right here on both of the tops so that some air can flow through and also the cables can come out of the top. So I'll be doing that at the bandsaw. I have both of the tops taped together so that I only have to make a single pass to cut both of the tops. This is going to be kind of a sharp curve for this wide 3/8 inch blade. So what I'll do is I'll come in straight to create a curve, and then come in again straight to create a relief curve, and then I'll do these curved cuts, and then I'll probably set up the fence to do this straight section. Okay, so now I can clean up the cut at the oscillating spindle sander. I've got a little bit more to clean up right here. Okay, now these are going to be a friction fit right now into the top of the boxes, and that won't be good to make it easy to remove these lids as necessary. So I'll need to cut these down ever so slightly in length and also in width so that they fit into the top of the boxes with ease. I'll probably only take off maybe a 32nd of an inch from each dimension. The lids fit onto the boxes nicely. They're easy to remove and easy to reinstall as they're 1/32 inch smaller in each dimension than the top of the box. Items fit down inside pretty well. There's plenty of room inside for everything. I still have to build a standoff to raise up the switch off of the UPS unit down here. But I can do that later. So now all I need to do is do a little bit of final sanding on this and then apply a finish onto it. Using a little bit of glue and sawdust to close up this small gap that's in this area right through here. It seems to be working pretty well. It's just a real small gap here and there where the plywood kind of peeled away. So now if I can sand that without burning through the very thin veneer, it'll look pretty nice. I've got a coat of finish on the boxes now, and that really adds a nice touch to the oak plywood. That's all for today. Thanks for watching. Bye.